The talk will last about 30 odd minutes, followed by a Q&A for another 30 minutes. During the Q&A, people can ask questions. I'll have to repeat the question while standing here so that Professor Diesen can hear the question. After the Q&A, you're welcome to continue your discussions over tea and coffee next door. Please allow me to mention who United Nations Harpenden is. We are a civil society group that has existed in Harpenden since 1922, initially as a branch of the League of Nations. In 1947, this became a local group of the United Nations Association UK. We cover Harpenden as well as St. Albans and Welwyn Garden City. These are neighboring towns and cities. They used to have their own local UNA groups, but they have now been absorbed into our group. We have a mailing list of about 300 subscribers. As a group, we support the goals and objectives of the United Nations and the work carried out by its various organs such as WHO, UNHCR, UNICEF, etc. We campaigned on issues such as ending wars, ending nuclear weapons, climate change, strengthening peace, human rights, social justice, democracy, sustainable development, everything you can think of, and reforming the UN itself. Working together with our sister groups in the UK, we develop resolutions on our campaign issues and submit them to the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office to influence government policy. We hold regular public meetings, usually in this hall. We have talks from guest speakers from universities, NGOs, and UN agencies. Some of our speakers speak from remote locations such as the US and Norway. Admission to our talks is free and there is no membership fee. To attend, you just need to register online. However, we appreciate any money you may have given or can give to cover our expenses, can pay in cash or credit card, or scan the QR code where you see one. Our next public talk will be on Saturday, 21st September at the Salvation Army Hall. The talk entitled Planning the British Economy for a Generational Divide, Longer Commutes and Lost Prosperity will be given by Emeritus Professor Paul Cheshire of the London School of Economics and Political Science. He'll be present in the hall. If you have missed any of our previous talks, you can catch up via the recordings posted on our website. Our website also has our history, constitution, campaigns, etc. We have a monthly newsletter with UN and campaign-related news, which we email to our subscribers. We also hold discussion group meetings and annual garden party, a Christmas quiz. You're welcome to come to that. We are also planning to hold a regular coffee morning at a local pub next year. We have a small committee of elected members. We welcome anyone wishing to help us. We are short of help, so please feel free to approach me if you're interested. Before I announce our guest speaker, I just want to make sure our recording is on. It is on, and you can all see the screen. Hopefully you can hear well. Let me now announce our guest speaker. Glenn Diesen is a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway, USN, and an associate editor at the Russia in Global Affairs journal. Diesen's research focus is Russia's transition from the Greater European Initiative to the Greater Eurasian Partnership. Diesen has previously published 9 books, a multitude of journal articles, and is a frequent contributor to international media. Recent titles include The Return of Eurasia, Palgrave Macmillan with Alexander Lukin, and The Think Tank Racket of Clarity Press. So without further ado, Glenn Diesen. Glenn, it's all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and I apologize for not being able to come in person. So the topic of mine today is something I guess everyone's recognizing is currently happening, which is effectively the end of a very historic period, or the end of a world order. And we see that the unipolar world order, in which there's only one center of power, And this is the order which we had since the end of the Cold War. Now, this has come to an end, and I would like to explore why this more or less had to happen, the conflicts that it causes, and lastly, the future world which is now emerging and what it will most likely look like. So I especially want to look at this through the context of this strategic partnership between Russia and China, as this is a partnership that is really spearheading the rise of a multipolar world. Now, we have now obviously a war in Europe. There's a war in the Middle East that could quickly expand. But also, as the United States argues, these two wars are a bit of a distraction, as its primary adversary is China. So there might also be a war in Asia, then probably over Taiwan or Philippines or other areas which could spark a war. Now, I would argue that all these wars have the same origin, which is that unipolar order has coming to an end or is already collapsing. Now, the economic and security architecture set up after the Cold War in the 1990s, it largely reflected this concentration of power, the dominance of the political West. Now, as this dominance diminishes, the institutions and system hasn't really been reformed, and that's what a lot of our conflicts are about. But in these conflicts, we can also see clear signs of the new world which is now emerging, although all decisions have still not been made in terms of what this system will look like. So my first point really I want to address is sorry, did you see my PowerPoint there? And I forgot to ask.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, what was the Unipolar World Order and why did it predictably collapse? So I thought it's good to open with a quote, and this is by Antonio Gramsci. He wrote that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Now, this was not from present time, obviously. He wrote this in the late 20s or early 30s, in which Gramsci attempted to explain the catastrophe which we're moving towards. So essentially, the old world was dying and the new world could not be born, and this is where the crisis emerged. Now, my arguments are much of the same. We are now currently in the midst of a collapse of this unipolar world order based on hegemony, and the new world order based on multipolarity, that is many centers of power, it can't really be born. And we're seeing now the world being pulled in two different directions as the Americans and many of their European allies attempt to restore the hegemonic system established after the Cold War, while not just Russia and China, but we see most of the rest of the world actually is also pushing towards multipolarity, not as an anti-Western bloc, but simply to be able to facilitate the realities of these new centers of power which are emerging. So it's for this reason our conflicts also emerge in this vacuum, and obviously China and Russia are often at the center of this as they're pushing or spearheading this change. But we also as we've seen over the past few years, even American friends and allies, be it Turkey or Saudi Arabia, Hungary for that sake, many others, they also want a return to multipolarity. And this is to a large extent why the Americans do not get the expected support. And just to bring back the point, I don't think this is because they're taking the side of opponents, but they're pushing also for a multipolar system. So I wanted to make the case for the world order we had for the past 30 years, the decision made after the Cold War, because there were good arguments for this. Now, the point of departure in international relations is really the international anarchy, as there's no world government, so all states has to ensure their own security and survival. So this creates security competition. Obviously, if the US develops military power for security, that would lead to insecurity, for example, to China. And this is largely the source of many conflicts and wars. Now, at the end of the Cold War, and then 2 years later, the collapse of the Soviet Union, it created an entirely new situation. So there was only one center of power in the world, the United States, and in alliance with its allies, the European powers, the US-led West was really dominant in all spheres. So this unique situation therefore created this discussion for what the new world should look like. And there were essentially two possible models we could follow. One was then the return to multipolarity, which would accept many centers of power. Now, this would require, for example, the US to scale back its military and develop new inclusive security institutions, effectively dismantle a lot of these alliance systems from the Cold War, and then accept a balance of power. Option two was, of course, a hegemonic system, a unipolarity, in which an international system based on the US dominance in the entire international system. So instead then of dismantling military alliances from the Cold War, such as NATO, they would be expanded, and the US and its allies would then take on this job of maintaining peace around the world. So this is the familiar picture of the US as the world policeman, which we all become very familiar. Now, the arguments for this system obviously was, I would say, twofold in terms of what a world order refers to. It's both the distribution of power and the values they represent. Now, if you look at the distribution of power, the argument was made that the hegemony reduces the international anarchy. Because if there's only one center of power, which the United States called for, that no other power should even have the aspirations to challenge it, or even group of states, this would be a source of stability. The anarchy would be reduced, much as what we in Europe experienced after the Second World War. It's good to have the Americans there because we compete less fiercely among ourselves. So this was intended to be extended globally. And second, of course, is universal values. That is, if the US and the collective West are the collective hegemon, the idea would be that we could raise the role of liberal values in the international system to create a more peaceful world. So free trade, liberal democracy, human rights, all of these ideas would essentially transcend the history of the world and create effectively restoring this era of Pax Romana, which refers to this 200-year period in under the Roman Empire, in which there was a hegemon, and this was a prosperous time. So this effectively Pax Americana was the strong argument which was being made. So not only for cynical reasons, but this was the world order as everyone spoke more optimistically, obviously, in the 90s, not so much anymore. Because from the 90s, we also had the argument against liberal hegemony. And many arguments against it focused on the fact that hegemony would not be so peaceful, and it would not unavoidably also be a temporary construct. And one can ask why. Well, why wouldn't it be peaceful? Because the argument was that by preserving hegemonic distribution of power, it requires a system of peacetime alliances. And anyone familiar with political realism would know that peacetime alliances is considered to be very disruptive and problematic, as it can instigate conflicts. It is necessary to maintain conflicts and dividing lines, as this creates weakened adversaries and dependent allies. So, for example, in the US-led alliance system, it still very much depends on these dividing lines. So, for example, between China and India, if these two countries can be in conflict, then obviously the US has an ally to weaken its Chinese opponent, and also the Indians would then be more reliant on the United States and more political obedient. We see the same now, a good case study, I would say, over the past year with Saudi Arabia and Iran, after the Chinese negotiated this peace between them, that this deprived the US of an important ally against not just Iran, but also against Yemen. So again, its adversaries are not properly weakened, and its allies are no longer that dependent on the United States. And the same obviously goes here in Europe with Europe and Russia, or more specifically Germany and Russia. Over time, if there's no tensions at all, Germany began to integrate its economy closer and closer to Russia, something that was deemed to be problematic for the United States, as an adversary gets more powerful and an ally becomes less, for better word, obedient. And this is a problem for hegemonies, not just the United States, but hegemony weakens when peace breaks out, as security dependence can no longer then be converted into economic and political loyalties. We also see that a key argument against is that international law cannot really persist as strongly under hegemony either, because an international system based on balance of power, all states would have to agree to an international law based on mutual constraints. So we don't interfere in each other's internal affairs, we limit the use of military power. In other words, it's equality of sovereignty. So we give up something, but we get predictability and reciprocity back. So this is international law, mutual constraints in accordance with the Charter, the UN Charter. But in a hegemonic system, why should the dominant power accept any limitations? Others cannot limit the power of the hegemon, and as we know, states don't really impose that many constraints on themselves. So instead, we see after the Cold War, there has been all these incentives to support effectively an ideology of sovereign inequality. That is complete sovereignty for us, but limited sovereignty for our opponents. So for example, we argue that we can promote democracy, so we are allowed to interfere in domestic affairs. We can use military force if we refer to humanitarian interventions. We can split up, take territories from other states such as Kosovo under the wording of self-determination, and also, of course, we had the global war on terror. So these are the common denominators, effectively, that we maintain our sovereignty, but others will have to accept limited sovereignty. Now, one can argue this, of course, has good intentions if it is to preserve human rights, but nonetheless, it's a system of sovereign inequality. And this is what often the US refers to as the rules-based international order, in which you have two sets of rules. And this is also why it's important to recognize why not just China, Russia, but many other countries around the world fiercely reject what's referred to as the rules-based international order, and instead they insist on international law. Now, this is also the international system today. We see the collapse of this hegemonic system, but there's no real consensus anymore in terms of restoring multipolarity. So not only are we between two systems, but we no longer have the same rules either. So this is why it wouldn't necessarily be peaceful. The second is also that hegemony was always recognized to be a temporary construct by its opponent, because the common warnings in the 1990s was that, much like running an empire, it's costly and it creates enemies. So we can look at the cost. It was very much predicted in the 90s that the US would gradually weaken as its resources must be transferred from the core to the periphery. So infrastructure, the US would decline, its economic competitiveness would decline as well, reduced standard of living, we would see debt levels unsustainable. I think the US has now reached, or at least almost $35 trillion in the hole, so it's becoming very unsustainable. Economic inequalities would begin to increase. This would lead to social problems, political polarization. So again, the cost of running a hegemonic order would be not bearable in the long run. But we also see the warning that democracy would not be compatible with what is then effectively empire. So the US would then weaken from within over time. A hypothesis which many would argue now has played out as expected. But it also has a different problem. That is, it creates enemies because it's expected that the rest of the world would then gradually begin to cooperate to collectively balance the US. Simply because if you want to preserve one center of power, it requires weakening or keeping down other rising centers of power. Otherwise, it would no longer be a hegemonic system. And we now see this happening as well, not just the strategic partnership between China and Russia, which also now includes India, but also the BRICS +5, which we'll talk about, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all these new forms of economic cooperation, also military cooperation. So we see now these partnerships which never existed really before. Russia-Iran, Russia-India, Russia-China, and of course, China-Iran, like it goes, a very complicated set of partnerships which are now deepening. So for the rest of my talk, I really want to discuss the conflicts that unipolarity created, but also how this new world order is coming to be, to a large extent because of these conflicts as well. So I would say that the predictable collapse of unipolarity and return to war, it's worth then looking at China and Russia, as they are the main countries who are seen as being not being able to fit within this international system, much like Germany wouldn't fit within a British hegemonic system before the First World War. Now, so let's start with Russia, because to a large extent we cancelled the peace with Russia in the peace agreements with Russia in the 1990s, and as a result, we've seen the predictable collapse of pan-European security. So obviously, the Cold War created a very difficult legacy because we had two centers of power with two incompatible ideologies. But both sides attempted to find some common ground for peace, but we still saw that conflicts was necessary to some extent to preserve this bipolar power structure due to security dependence. Now, a common security system began to develop, I would say, already with the Helsinki Accords in 1975 as a set of a framework, at least, for cooperation between East and West. And this then developed further, and it motivated, Gorbachev's reforms and also his visions of a common European home, which could replace this confrontational system of competing military alliances. And this also then resulted in the negotiation of an end to the Cold War in 1989. And as we saw in 1990, we had quite a pivotal agreement, which was the Charter of Paris for a New Europe. This was built on the Helsinki Accords, recognizing that the Cold War was over. The agreement for a new Europe entailed to develop a Europe without dividing lines, one of indivisible security, and also sovereign equality. Now, these principles were then 4 years later also translated into an actual inclusive security institution, which is the OSCE, which is supposed to create a common Europe. To some extent, along the ideas of Gorbachev's common European home. But then, of course, the expansion of NATO disrupted this to a large extent. But the expansion of NATO was also, the ideal was to accommodate liberal hegemony. But it also began the collapse of European security, pan-European security at least. That is a Europe without dividing lines, because instead we replaced it with moving the dividing lines closer and closer to Russian borders. Also, instead of indivisible security, NATO enhanced its security at the expense of Russia, so this would intensify security competition, and also sovereign inequality, as the liberal democratic West created unique rules for itself. That is the prerogative to challenge the principle of sovereignty, so promoting democracy, humanitarian interventions, this sort of things. So this pretty much set us on a path to a new Cold War. Now, I'm aware that these days all criticism of NATO expansion is very quickly dismissed as Russian propaganda, but this was then recognized as common sense by many leading political leaders. And the reason why it created conflicts was that it cancelled this mutually acceptable post-Cold War settlement, as there was no longer any need for it. And instead, because Russia was weak, we were able to then push for hegemony through NATO instead. And just a few quotations, given that this is not something one is allowed to say anymore these days. But it was something that President Bill Clinton cautioned in January of '94, before the decision had been made, in which he argued that NATO expansion could draw a new line between East and West that could create self-fulfilling prophecy of future confrontation. His Secretary of Defense, William Perry, even threatened to resign once they decided to expand NATO. As he argued, it wasn't that we didn't listen to Russia's argument and said we don't agree with that argument. The response that Perry got from his other people in the administration was, who cares what the Russians think? They're a third-rate power. So in other words, they recognized this would cause problems, but as we remember in the 90s, Russia was weak and it was seen as not being that relevant, what they thought anymore. The ambassador Jack Matlock, who contributed to negotiating an end to the Cold War, he also recognized that this would cancel the peace with Russia. And but as he argued that NATO expansion is misguided and may well go down in history as the most profound strategic blunder made since the end of the Cold War. Even Ambassador George Kennan, who was seen as the being the top diplomat in the United States. He was, well, ambassador to Moscow in the 50s, but he was also the main architect of the containment policies against the Soviet Union. Now, in 98, he argued that he predicted NATO expansion would be the beginning of a new Cold War. And he said there was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anyone else. Of course, there's going to be a bad reaction from Russia. And then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that this is just the way the Russians are. But as he said, this is just wrong. And I guess very quickly to other secretaries of states, James Baker, he warned that the main idea of having NATO as an insurance policy, that is, if we expand NATO, surround Russia with NATO military infrastructure, this would be an insurance policy in case relations with Russia would go bad in the future. He warned that this would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and therefore suggested we should instead get Russia in NATO if we have to expand it. Madeleine Albright, she was very for expanding NATO, but she argued for the insurance policy exactly because if we have conflicts with Russia, at least NATO will be on Russia's doorstep. And but she still recognized that it was strongly opposed by Russia, who sees it as a strategy for exploiting their vulnerability and moving Europe's dividing line to the east, leaving them isolated. Of course, Ukraine was much more unique simply because this was really a red line. As Angela Merkel argued, it would be expanding to Ukraine would be interpreted as a declaration of war. And well, Britain's own ambassador to Russia, Roderick Lyne, he argued in 2020 that this was a huge mistake on the Western side to try to push Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. It was stupid at every level at that time. If you want to start a war with Russia, that's the best way of doing it. Moreover, any poll in Ukraine showed that 2/3 of Ukrainian public did not want NATO membership. So the point of some of this is just they said the conflicts were seen coming. Also on the American side, where Robert Gates, who was former US Secretary of Defense and also CIA director, argued that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was really overreaching. We also have William Burns, who was an American ambassador to Russia, but now he's the CIA director, who argued that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elites, not just Putin. And he argued Russia is particularly worried about the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with so much of the ethnic Russian community against membership. It could lead to a major split involving violence, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether or not to intervene, something he argued a decision Russia would not want to have to face. So my argument is simply this, that we knew very well that developing a security architecture based on expanding a military alliance closer to Russian borders would eventually ignite a security competition and start a Cold War. Just to clarify, this is not to justify any Russian invasion, much like these people I've cited didn't attempt to justify it either. But in the first Cold War, the dividing lines in Europe were clearly delineated, and we therefore fought our proxy wars in the Third World. But in this Cold War, we will likely fight over where to draw the dividing lines within Europe. So this deeply divided societies of Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, this will probably be our main battlefields. So we also knew that Ukraine was also one bridge too far and would likely trigger a war. It's comparable to Mexico. One can imagine if China or Russia attempted to establish a military alliance with Mexico and places missiles and bases there, it would meet similar reactions from the United States. So why was it done nonetheless? Again, it was an instrument for the Unipolar World Order as opposed to an inclusive security architecture. So that led to the cancellation of the peace with the Russians after the Cold War. And I argue that we're similarly seeing a cancellation of the peace with China now, simply because with China, the US did establish the foundation for a mutually acceptable peace in the end of the 1970s. And this foundation was based on the principle of one China. So as Jimmy Carter at the time argued, this meant that there's only one China, Taiwan is a part of China, and the capital then is Beijing. So President Jimmy Carter therefore limited the US only to economic and cultural ties to Taiwan, and China, on its part, would only use peaceful means for reintegrating Taiwan. But as US power is now in relative decline and the unipolar order is threatened, we see that the US responds by enhancing its position vis-a-vis China, which is then manifesting itself in this gradual push for Taiwan secession. So we see this now as the one China principle is breached gradually. So we see visits by leading politicians from the United States, the top politicians. We see now military trainers only on islands of Taiwan, only a few kilometers away from the Chinese mainland. We see greater push by the United States for representation of Taiwan in international institutions such as the UN. The whole ambiguity about defending Taiwan for 40 years is now gone. I think Joe Biden has argued at 4 different occasions that the US would come to Taiwan's defense, even though some of those times they were attempted to be walked back, and also emboldening secessionists within Taiwan. So this is what the Chinese are also responding to, in which they're arguing if they're continuing down this path, China reserves the right to integrate Taiwan with military force instead. Now, obviously, I personally sympathize with arguments about Taiwanese shouldn't be allowed, self-determination, which is all fine and well, but it also makes the US a revisionist power, because by abandoning this one China principle, we also see that it cancels the mutually acceptable agreement or foundation for peace, which has been for more than 40 years, not just between US and China, but also the stability of Asia. So irrespective of any benign intentions, I would say that this choice could start a Cold War, if not even a hot war, in the not too distant future. So given the temporary nature of the unipolar order, and also the conflicts that are resulted from it, it just takes me to my last point, which is that we're now heading towards a multipolar world order. As both China and Russia recognize, they can't really have a peace anymore with the US or the collective West in a unipolar world, simply that well, for many reasons, you don't fit within this format, and they're also pushing for multipolarity. The good news, I guess, is that they're not inherently anti-Western, but they're very anti-hegemonic and insisting on multipolarity. And we see, therefore, that much of the rest of the world is also aligning behind these ideas. And again, it's different from the Cold War. It's not 2 blocks and the world is aligning in a block against us. Rather, the world is leaning towards a multipolar world order, which can accommodate many centers of power. So it's worth seeing what a huge significant shift. The reason why I went into all these details about Russia was its foreign policy is now changed more than any time in the past 300 years, in my opinion, because it was in the beginning, in the early 18th century, after the Greater Northern War, that Peter the Great really was able to establish Russia as a European power by defeating Sweden and the Baltic Sea. Now, since the beginning of the 18th century, modernization and economic development in Russia always meant to Europeanize Russia. This is when Russia looks to the West. And this also manifested itself in what Russia referred to as its Greater Europe initiative, to create a common Europe. Now, obviously, we had Gorbachev's common European home. This developed further to Yeltsin's efforts to integrate into the West. He believed, without the communism and all the partnerships of the East, it would be easier to get Russia to integrate into the West. But into the West often meant unilateral concessions, and Russia just grew weak and then could be cut out from Europe altogether. So this was deemed to be a liberal delusion. So the entire platform of Yeltsin obviously collapsed when NATO began to expand in 1999. And this is also when he's decided eventually to step down and hand over power to his prime minister, which was then Putin. So Putin changed the tactic. He still wanted integration with the West, so pursuing, but he wanted integration with the West, not into. And this is a difference. This meant that they wanted as equal partners, not through unilateral concessions. But this also did not work. Again, he proposed Russian membership in NATO. They proposed a new security architecture in 2008, proposed the EU-Russian Union in 2010, effectively bringing together the markets. All of this were rejected. And after the West backed the toppling of Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014, there was an earthquake in Russian policy, because this was the final evidence, if you will, that Ukraine would not be a bridge, but instead a front line, and Russia would not be gradually integrated into the West, rather there would be a hard front. So this is, one can agree or disagree with this, but this is what really changed in Russia. And even as the sanctions then followed in 2014, even the people who wanted to integrate more with Europe had to recognize that this was now, had come to an end. And we therefore saw this whole Europe initiative replaced with what is now the Greater Eurasia Initiative. This responds to the rise of Asia, simply because Russia no longer had to be at the dual periphery of Europe and East Asia. Instead, it can be at the center of a Greater Eurasia, which aims to integrate this whole vast, huge continent. And it's also seen as an economically more viable integration project, as it looks now more at the West as stagnant, more ideological and belligerent towards Russia. When it looks east, it's seen more dynamic, pragmatic, and accommodating east. And they also reconceptualize effectively Eurasianism to economics. So this is a great place for it to develop its strategic industries, transportation corridors, and financial instruments. Now, for China, so again, this was the huge, for me, this has ended essentially 300 years of looking towards the West for modernization. So now they want to look east. And this happened at the exact same time as China changed its policies. Keep in mind that since the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century, China had its century of humiliation. Well, this was seen to end when Mao took power, and in 49 he argued again, the Chinese people have risen, but this gave 30 years, yes, of more independence and sovereignty, but nonetheless horrible economics, as we all know. And this 30-year period ended in 78 when Xiaoping pursued development of the market economy and what he called a peaceful rise, which was effectively look internally development in China without causing any concerns or waves in international affairs. This lasted 30 years until the global financial crisis. At this point in time, the United States was not seen to be that they wouldn't necessarily get their money back from financing the US. So they looked more towards developing other trading partners and reducing dependence on the West. And this was really when the Chinese developed their Belt and Road Initiative, which much of this began in 2013, exactly the same time as the destabilization of Ukraine began. So to understand this geoeconomics of what the New World Order is looking like, it shouldn't be that alien to us. As we can remember, when the Americans attempted to reduce their dependence on the British in the beginning of the 19th century, they had the American system, which had three pillars. They needed a manufacturing industry. They wanted a physical connectivity with new roads, canals, and ports. And third was national bank and national currency. And this, by having economic independence, it was believed they would also pursue political independence. Now, this is a personal argument of mine, not the official policies of the Russians and Chinese, but from my perspective, they're following, to a large extent, the same format. As we see with both China and Russia, they're pursuing the same American system in terms of geoeconomics. And for two reasons. They don't, and also it's worth arguing why it's been efficient. And that's because the unipolar system is not working that well for the rest of the world, simply because much like a monopoly, it becomes inefficient. There's high prices, low quality, and it can also be weaponized as there's no ability for other states to diversify. And this is what we're seeing in the unipolar system. So we see therefore that the Chinese, especially with their industries, strategic industries, are now are now beginning to take the lead. They have the China 2025 initiative, in which they seek to be the leader in all the main high-tech technologies over the next within this new technological revolution. The Russians have also made sure that all of their digital giants operating in Russia, that the Russians are really the main actor, but also, of course, in partnership with the Chinese. And of course, also pursuing energy security and pushing their economic integration within this Eurasian space. Now, these efforts to develop decouple a bit from the West with strategic industries has, of course, been also fueled by the policies of the West itself. Keep in mind that the United States is very open about its desires to begin to cripple Chinese industries by putting sanctions on all its semiconductor industries and really trying to cut off its main economic rival. None of this is obviously consistent with the World Trade Organization rules, and we also see the same challenges with energy security for the Russians, which is that the Europeans have been trying very hard to cut off reliance on Russian energy, and also, of course, there was attack on the Nord Stream pipeline. So for them, it's more interesting now to have the energy go east instead. And also, as we see now with the sanctions on Russia, their access to technologies in the West has been cut off. So they're also intensifying their strategic autonomy and also shifting their most vital partnerships towards the East, be it India or China or anything outside the West. The second is then the transportation corridors. This is the physical connectivity. Here we're seeing the Chinese then especially taking the lead. Obviously, as they're becoming an economic rival to the US, they become more concerned about these maritime choke points where the US can cut them off. So we see now that the Chinese are put trillions of dollars into this Belt and Road Initiative and connecting the world with infrastructure. And the Russians are also pushing similar initiatives after we stopped. After we cut all connections with Russia in the Arctic Council, the Russians are now looking to develop the Arctic more with China, India, even some Arab states and Southeast Asian states. We see this transportation corridor going from Russia, Iran to India. So the whole continent's being more and more integrated. For anyone familiar with Mackinder, this would be follow line this recipe. And last is the financial instruments, which we see then BRICS growing, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the development now of commodity exchanges. Of course, the BRICS now supports Russia's development of grain exchange, as they don't want the West anymore to set the standards and pricing. And this will then be operational in October. Once this is up and running, it would likely expand to other commodities as well to further decouple from the West. We see more and more development banks, be it BRICS or the Eurasian Economic Union, AIIB, several, challenging now the IMF simply because the IMF is seen as being too expensive, too many political conditions, and also one can have its access cut. We also see then the payment systems. As we know, SWIFT is the main transaction system in the world. This is problematic. This allows the US to put its sanctions, be it on allies like France, but also Iran. But now we see they also cut off the Russians of it. So the Chinese have established SIPs. The Russians have their own equivalent, and they're now working to diversify as well. And last is, of course, the de-dollarization, as there's no interest anymore to use only the US dollar. This is seen to give the US a huge privilege in the international system, and also it allows effectively US to tax the rest of the international system. And after seizing or freezing the $300 billion of the Russians and now stealing some of that money, the rest of the world has grown more wary. Let me see. Okay, I'll spend a bit too much time, so I'll cut a bit faster through this. So the main idea is to diversify economic connectivity to avoid any excessive dependence on other states. And this is also why the Russians have been able to avoid conflicts with the Chinese, simply because Russia accepts that China will be the leading economy, but they don't want them to dominate. And this has translated into effectively that the Chinese don't mind that Russians diversifying, connecting closer with India, for example. This way, China will still be the leading power, but not dominate. And this is also why the Central Asian question has been solved, because there won't be hegemonic power. Instead, the Russians invite India and other countries into the region under the same principle that the China will still be the leading economy, but they can't dictate it at all. Something the Chinese seem content with. And last is that the rest of the world is leaning towards this, simply because a declining hegemon will then weaponize economic dependence more and more, as we've seen over the past few years. So diversification gives medium-sized and smaller states the opportunity to act more independently. So we see whether it's India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, but also South America, Africa. We see as the BRICS strengthen, more and more states want to join, and the queue is getting longer, and everyone is wanting this commodity exchanges. They want the de-dollarization. They want alternative development banks, and also some of this can then be used for example, as we see pushing France out of Africa, and as much of the world, as Kishore Mahbubani, the former president of the UN's Security Council, argued. He argued that the rest of the world does not support necessarily things like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they also don't want to see the West defeat Russia, because, as he argues, the West will once again become arrogant and insufferable if it defeats Russia completely, something that's not in the interest of the rest of the world. So, and the reason why many countries want this political independence from having less economic dependence on the West is simply that they will then be able to develop an international system which rejects more the idea of universal values to the extent it allows the diminishment of sovereignty of other states. And so this puts this new world coming into place puts pressure or a dilemma for the West, or then especially the United States. And this choice, effectively, I borrow from Brzezinski, because he wrote probably the best book in the 90s about the argument why the US should develop a global hegemon. In 2012, he argued that the US that the hegemony has now beginning to be lost, and he argued that the dilemma was as such: the US could either push for organizing a multipolar system, where it will be the first among equals, so a favorable multipolar system. Alternatively, they could try to push to extend unipolarity, but then they would see a multipolar system emerge in opposition to the United States. Now, this was written 12 years ago, and I would argue that it was the second option which the US has gone with. And it's now seeing all these new centers of power coming together to create an entirely new economic and financial system, which the US will have a significantly less role. I could say something about more about the rejection of universal values, but I think I've run a bit out of time. And as always, I tend to shamelessly promote my books at the end. So this is my last book, my 11th book, which came out a few months ago. So yes, I will leave it there, and we can hopefully left some time for questions.
Thank you very much. That's a lot of information in half an hour. So sorry to squeeze you like that, but it was an excellent talk. Let's give Glenn a I'm sorry, Glenn, you can't see the audience, but we'll take questions now. And Bob, do you mind doing the mic? Yeah. Yeah. Carry on.
Who is it that wants us on confessions? Somehow I don't believe that we, the people, I don't think that we, the people in Russia or in China or India or wherever, that we, the people, want any of it. So we have to ask ourselves, who is going to benefit from it, and what can we do?
Thank you. Question from from the audience is, who wants confrontation? Because we, the people in the West and the whole world, don't want confrontation. Who is it actually that is wanting to benefit from this confrontation?
Well, obviously, there's always economic interests which are tied into preserving status quo. But I think it's much beyond that as well. I think it's very difficult to change a world order. If we look through history, most world orders have been only changed after major wars. That's the way to solve these huge disruptions. Obviously, not something I advocate for, but also I think that there's a very strong political consensus formed in the West after the Cold War, in which the Americans who wanted primacy within the global primacy within the neocons, they found the liberal idealists as allies essentially, because there's also strong arguments for hegemony from the idealists. So I think all of this should be more familiar with for British actually, because a lot of these discussions were held in Britain in the 19th century as well, when they argued, is a liberal hegemony, is hegemony consistent with liberalism? And you saw then John Stuart Mill, many of them arguing that no, hegemony can actually be good for liberalism. It's a good way of spreading it. So I think that a lot of this formed a partnership or common interest, both by the neocons and liberal idealists. So I think that after 30 years of this system, where we can go on a larger time frame of the West effectively dominating the world for the past few centuries, it's very hard to recognize that this world is coming to an end. And I think there's a very strong impulse usually to denounce all challenges as a challenge to democracy and freedom and human rights instead of. So I think what's lacking in the West now is not just recognizing where different capital interests are in preserving the status quo, but also that there's a lack of political imagination. We should recognize that the world is already shifting, and our problem isn't mainly China or Russia, but for example, when British politicians go to India and they attempt to dictate what their foreign policy should look like, it seems very natural from her side that this is something we would do, but it's quite absurd from the Indian side, and that this is this world is gone. They expect to have political autonomy, and for this they also require then economic diversification. So I think lack of political imagination to recognize the huge challenges we are for, and a very simplistic political discourse where everything is good versus evil, and anyone who opposes us is almost treasonous.
Thank you. Mick, did you want a question?
Actually, I was just saying regardless of something. I will ask, as an academic, do you find you're consulted at all by people who run communication systems in your country or West generally? Give your views?
Yep. Question is, as an academic, do you find yourself being asked to contribute your views to communication and other institutions, in the media in general, your views to the media? Are you asked about your views by the media in general?
Not in this country, but outside. I've been invited sometimes on BBC, some German newspapers, but mostly it's outside the West. So be it China, Russia, or I'm usually once a week on Indian TV, once or twice a week on Arabic TVs. So it's easier with media once you get some distance, because within the West now, it's either you repeat the talking points of the war narrative, otherwise there's a tendency to question whether you pick the side of the opponent. So if I'm arguing that, you know, these sanctions against Russia, for example, they are destroying the trust of the West, the rest of the world looking at us stealing money effectively from the Russians. We're looking at horror of trying to cripple the Chinese economy. I'm trying to warn that, first of all, these sanctions won't work, and second, they will harm us greatly. The response usually is, you know, why are you taking the side of Putin? You know, so it's not very nuanced. It's very propagandistic, the discourse here. So I find a lot of hostility in the media here, but outside the West, I think there's more recognizing the difference and maybe being more accommodating of it. And it's a big problem. People don't have to agree with me, but it's kind of frightening that there's no debate anymore. That you know, we're at this huge shift now. Everyone's recognizing unipolarity is coming to an end, and we limited ourselves to this good versus evil, democracy versus authoritarian line of thinking, in which you either repeat or you demonize. So I think it's a great shame. There's not more discussion anymore.
Thank you. There's appreciation from the crowd.
Glad to
There's
hear.
a question on the Zoom channel chat. The ambition from Sardar Alayarov. The ambition of China regarding the unification of Taiwan is clear. What do you think of Chinese geopolitical restoration in the distant future with respect to the southeast corner of Siberia, which was forcibly gained by Russia based on unequal treaties? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that is why, well, after the Opium Wars, when they were defeated by the British, the Russians also took advantage, of course, as we remember that time. They seized huge chunks of territory from China. And for the Chinese, this has many problems. For example, its two northeastern regions are now landlocked because the Russians seized the entire coastline. Now, the Russians have some options. They how they would solve this problems. Now, obviously, with the Chinese, they solved all their border disputes. I think it was back in 2004. The Russians simply recognized that China will be more powerful tomorrow, so it's better to solve the border disputes today. So, but nonetheless, no, sorry, I think it was 2014. But anyways, my point is, how would they solve this problem? And they instead decided to integrate closer with China. So these two northeast regions in China, they're now connected more to the Pacific coast with Russian ports by rail, modernization of the ports, better trade agreements. So they found, instead of giving the Chinese an incentive to try to retake some territories, they tried to push for acceptance of the status quo, which meant, connecting these regions so they become more prosperous, but also, solving their border disputes with the Chinese. Obviously, as China becomes more and more powerful, one could argue that its intentions will change as well. It might become more arrogant. It might put more demands not just on Russia but other areas as well. And this is why I think it's important that we don't fall into a bipolar trap between only US or China, but it's better to have multipolarity. Because if the Chinese would start to, now Russia's their closest partner, but in the future, if they would start to lay claims on Russian territory and put pressure on Russia, they would simply lean more closely towards India instead, or Iran, or ideally relations with Europe would also be better by that time. And this is the good thing of a multipolar system. You create mechanisms which punishes belligerent behavior, because then they wouldn't want to use the Chinese bank, the Chinese technologies, the Chinese transportation corridors, the Chinese other industries. So this is why it's good to have a multipolar economic system. So I think given that the intentions will change over time, I think this is also an argument for multipolarity.
Thank you. Next question. Bob, after that, over there. Thank you. Carry on.
I feel in our recent elections and also in your discussion, we've avoided talking about the elephant in the room, which is climate change. And it seems to be the whole development you're talking about seems to be contrary to what we really need, which is international cooperation to beat the climate crisis. What do you think about that?
I don't know if
heading over a cliff at the moment.
Thank you. The question was, the elephant in the room is climate change, which requires cooperation. Sorry, let me just plug in my laptop before it runs out of power. Okay. So climate change, to address climate change requires cooperation. So what are we doing about that?
Well, this is a strong argument for why, at the end, when I put forward this choice, because this is a reality now, the new centers of power which are emerging, which don't want to feel like they're excessively dependent on the economic power of the West, which can be weaponized against them. So I think, yeah, the problem is we can either now attempt to defeat our adversaries, so create peace by effectively breaking, Russia, China, Iran, anyone who opposes us, which the path we're going now. But this would, of course, lead to ignoring all climate change cooperation, because we can't really deal with any degradation of the climate if we don't cooperate, which is why I'm also arguing that this would be much better to instead recognize the existing realities, that is the world, the international distribution of power has already shifted, and then we need institutions and economic systems which reflects this new reality. Now, if we fail to do this, I think a lot of the international institutions will break down. They won't work anymore, simply because they no longer reflect reality. And if we break into simply economic blocks competing against each other, where, for example, now the EU wants to put these huge tariffs on electric vehicles from China, for example. If we end up in this block thinking again, I think it will be devastating for our ability to counter climate change. It will be more and more symbolic instead of actually something that matters. But so, yeah, I don't think we can resolve these issues without proper institutions. But again, proper institutions must reflect reality as well. So this is why it's very dangerous that we're reverting into this block politics again, because if we can't find common ground and go into blocks, I think this will down prioritize any efforts to fight climate change.
I guess militarization also consumes a lot of power. So
very
that's
much
also...
so. Yeah. And yes, I couldn't agree more.
Next question over there. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Unlike the other questions, I will give my name because it is rather relevant. The information that has been posted by Russian sympathizers on Wikipedia about is false. It's outright lies. My name is Ewan Grant. I've been broadcasting for many years on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and I did on air predict that he would invade. I was asked very technically, and I said he would. I have two questions. One is, are you receiving money from Russian sources for your academic work in this broadcast? Secondly, do you have any comment on the situation of Evan Gershkovich? And I would ask everybody in this audience, ask themselves, have you heard of Evan Gershkovich? And perhaps you might want to ask yourself, if you haven't, why not? I will just point out, how on earth can the West be seen as a threat to Russia when so many powerful and connected Russians have assets in the West, and the daughter of Lvov's mistress, a postgraduate student in London who's just taken up a job with Gazprom, reportedly paid £4 million to buy a flat in Knightsbridge. Why putting so many assets in the West, in the enemy West, when it's all backwards? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if you heard that. That's from Ewan Grant, who's been commentating and predicting that there would be war with Russia. His first question is, are you getting any financial support or grant from Russia for your academic work, etc.? Second question is, have you heard of Ivan Denisovich? Is it Denisovich?
Evan Gershkovich.
Evan Gershkovich. His point is,
sure the gentleman
the point is, lots of Russians are investing in the West, etc. The point being, are they fabricated?
Oh, come on.
Okay.
Come on. No.
Sorry, what's your
What
question?
I mean is,
Yeah.
as you ought to know perfectly well,
Please repeat your question.
I'll speak slowly. They see Russia supposedly the West as an enemy, but powerful connected Russians, including the daughter of Foreign Minister of the Balkans, paid £4 million for a flat in London. So how on earth can there be genuine as opposed to fabricated arguments that the West is an enemy?
His point is that the point that the West is against Russia is fabricated because
No, please do not say
because
that. That is not what
okay,
I
okay,
said.
let me it's not very easy to his point is that the whole thing is fabricated because lots of people in Russia, including the daughter of some prominent person there, is investing in things in the West at the same time. So how is that possible, right? Did you? So
Yeah.
first question is, are you getting money from the Russian state, etc.? Secondly, all of this sounds disingenuous because there are people in Russia, prominent people, investing in the West at the moment.
Yeah, no, well, on the first question, no, I don't get any money from Russia. I'm a professor in Norway, so I don't get any paid from Russia. No money at all. Don't have a bank account there, nothing. And also, I do work for a journal as an editor for Russia and Global Affairs, but I don't get paid for it because, well, I don't have a work permit there. I used to work in the past, until 4 years ago, I worked for a few years as a professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, but since then I haven't gotten any money from Russia, but that was my salary. In terms of yeah, even Gershkovich, yeah, he's yeah, the Wall Street Journal journalist. So he's been arrested in Russia for espionage. Again, I don't have any information to what extent he's guilty or not. Obviously, this could be Russia using him for trying to trade off one of their prisoners in the US for this journalist. So that's a possibility. Or there's also a possibility, of course, that he's guilty. I wouldn't know, but I know also from in this country, in Norway, we also like to brag about how we have a lot of great espionage, and but whenever one of our spies gets caught, it's usually we put on a big show and say, you know, they're not. It's all being framed. They're not. You know, they're innocent. Now, just to make it clear, I'm not saying that he's guilty or not. I don't have that information. No one in Moscow is whispering in my ear. So it could be that they're simply trying that this is one that's arrested just for trade, which would make it very illegitimate, or it's an actual spy. I wouldn't know anything beyond that. And returns, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of Russians also investing in the West. I don't think it contradicts the development of this new economic systems and financial systems which are emerging. Individuals will put their money in different places, and for many years, this is where the Russians, as also well aware in the UK, that a lot of Russians would put their money in Britain, and a lot of oligarchs, and also in the United States, and so there's already a lot of existing interest there. So I don't think that contradicts the systemic incentives for the rest of the international system, and that's what we're seeing with all the huge powers around the world, be it Brazil or throughout Africa or India or Iran, Russia, China. They're all seeking to diversify their economic connectivity. They see it as being very harmful to be excessively dependent only on one actor, which is the United States. And as we see, when there's a hegemon in decline, it will use its administrative control over the international economy in a more coercive way in order to preserve its dominant position. And this then incentivizes these other poles of power to diversify quicker, to take away this ability. Now, so I don't see that as contradicting necessarily that individuals or even relatives of politicians would put some of their investment in the West. I think diversification can't be complete decoupling. I don't think that would be a good idea either, to completely sever all ties with the West.
Thank you.
Thank you for an excellent talk. My interest is that China last October bought its oil from Saudi Arabia, but this time China's the biggest single importer of oil from Saudi, and we pay for it in the cryptocurrency, the yuan cryptocurrency. And the question is this: with the Arab nations all saying the perpetual dollar, that's sending a very strong message to the United States and my opinion. And I just wondered if you have done any work on this and if you have a view on as to how this might pan out in the future.
Thank you. If I heard the question correctly, China has been buying oil from Saudi Arabia using cryptocurrency. Are other countries trying to move away from the petrodollar? What's your view on that issue?
Yes, well, obviously, I think, well, the China and Russia as the main energy producer and consumer, they really spearheaded this, but now you're seeing it spread as well. So recently, India and Nigeria made also economic trade agreements, which would also not use the dollar. And I think this new initiative in Saudi Arabia to also now move away from the petrodollar and also begin to sell their energy in non-dollar denominations is also quite significant, because keep in mind that the US dollar was set up as the world reserve currency after the Second World War, but it was tied to gold. After Nixon took it off gold, it was Kissinger made sure that the Arabs would sell their oil in only in dollars, and this became the source for the need for the US dollar. So it's quite significant of all countries that Saudi Arabia is now gradually moving away from it, and this is simply because they want to do more trade with the new rising centers of power, be it China. So, but it goes across not just the currencies they're trading in. They're also getting more technologies from China. They also want to link themselves to various value chains which the Chinese and others are linked to. So I think that it's also worth noticing that BRICS recently expanded. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and they took in Saudi Arabia as well as United Arab Emirates. Interestingly, they also took in Iran, which is their adversary, and they also took in Egypt and Ethiopia, which have their own water conflicts. So I think this will be an important thing for BRICS as they try to develop more commodity exchanges and take a lot of these mechanisms out of the West and create more autonomy within the BRICS system. So no, I think it will be very significant because when you look at when the petrodollar was established, it was Saudi Arabia which was at the center, and now Saudi Arabia is drifting away from it. But I also think that this is part of the new multipolar system developing as well, because keep in mind that while the United States pushed for renewed tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, it's interesting that both that BRICS as well as the China has attempted to integrate with both, because if they only integrate with Iran, they would alienate the Arabs. So it's therefore important for them to, when they increase their economic connectivity and take in new members in BRICS, that they take in both sides in the conflict. So taking both United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, both Egypt and Ethiopia. So in this way, try to resolve some of the conflicts between them and then improve economic ties with both sides. So I think this has been one of their approaches. But obviously, when you look at the partnership between Saudi Arabia and China, this will increasingly not be done in the dollar. Like the Chinese especially wants to move away from the dollar. So yeah, this is a huge defeat, I think, for the petrodollar.
Thank you. Any Peter behind you?
Thank you very much. I want to explore this relative importance of security architecture and economic change in the destabilization of this situation. Because you could argue that it's really the economic growth of China and the emergence of Russia as a significant economic power, which has been the real cause of change rather than adjustments to NATO structures. And was it not true that Russia feared Ukraine's membership of the EU more than it feared anything to do with security?
Question from Peter is that he believes the real cause of the conflict is the growth of China and Russia, etc., as economic powers rather than the encroachment of NATO. So what?
And the other part was about the membership of the EU being particularly threatening to Russia.
And the fact that the membership of EU being threatening to Russia, these are maybe are the causes of the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, the main push for the Russians in terms of Ukraine has been focused on NATO, though. This has been and it's important to recognize when in 2013 the EU put forward this association agreement to Ukraine. It was initially an issue between the EU and Ukraine. Now, in this agreement, the Ukrainians would then link its economy closer to Ukraine and away from Russia, but it also had security articles in it, which would then be seen to link Ukraine also closer to NATO. But what's interesting at that time is it already caused a lot of disruption because it was seen as a geopolitical move to cause divisions between Ukraine and Russia. So what happened back then was Ukraine and Russia, they proposed, was the end of 2013 or beginning of 2014, a trilateral agreement with the EU. They said, can we have an EU-Ukraine-Russia agreement? So Ukraine doesn't have to choose between East or West. It can simply be a bridge. And the head of the European Union, but also he argued, no, that's unacceptable. Ukraine has to choose, and that's when Ukraine chose to reject the economic agreement with the EU. So I think the economics, of course, it has something to do with it. But if you want to look at what the solutions to the conflict has been, it's always focusing on NATO, which is the hard security, as it's worth keeping in mind that after Russia invaded Ukraine, what we often neglect is on the first day after the invasion, on the 25th of February, Zelensky confirmed they had already been contacted by Russia and they want to start negotiations. But the negotiations had to be focused on restoring Ukraine's neutrality. And this was on the third day after the invasion. Ukraine and Russia both confirmed that they would start negotiations based on neutrality. Now, this was the Istanbul agreements, and they all fell apart, but it was blamed on the US and the UK for sabotaging them, as I guess most are familiar with Boris Johnson going to Kiev. Now, the whole point is the Israelis and the Turks who negotiated this, they made it very clear that the Russians were willing to negotiate on everything. They were, except for one thing, there was restoring neutrality for Ukraine. They couldn't accept NATO and US troops and missile bases occurring in Ukraine on the Russian borders. This was the main thing. So I think that was, I think this is the main issue. That being said, the ability of Russia to begin to decouple from Europe it couldn't have been done without an alternative new center of power. Now, one can say after the war began, before the war, obviously the India had no bought or barely any oil at all from Russia. Now Russia's their biggest oil exporter, so there's other centers of power. But obviously, it's the Chinese who is now the main and most important economic partner of Russia. So obviously, this is why since 2014, the Russians began to gradually reduce their dependence on the West and make themselves more and more sanction-proof. So this also could not have been done without China. So that's why I wanted to point out that this is a bit of a perfect storm, that at the same time in 2014 is when we will put the final nail in the coffin of Greater Europe. This is the same year that the Chinese, the year after the Chinese launched their Belt and Road Initiative. So I don't think anything has one cause, but definitely it's NATO enlargement, which in Russia's view is the main source of this conflict, and also what has to be resolved in order for there to be peace. But obviously the economic aspects are also quite important.
Thank you. Any more questions? If not, just turn the mic around. Oh, any?
Many years ago, I was very young in Chinese, and I said, "Welcome to South, welcome to Germany." And he had a bit of a face, and I asked, "Are you okay?" China's moving away from China because they're scared of what may happen, and I'm scared. And what I've kind of heard to that.
Sorry, China is moving away from
Their homeland.
homeland. Okay,
They're
Chinese.
taking over like anywhere, taking over the world, as Americans, as British, as anyone. Is it true that Putin is now in conversation with South Africa and the possibilities of obviously the trade that side of the world? Have you got anything to add to that?
If I've understood the question, the question from one of the audience who is from South Africa, his question is Putin doing some deal with South Africa in terms of trade, etc.? Have I got it right?
Yeah, no, I think that that's also an objective to increase economic ties with South Africa as one of the main BRICS countries. So yeah, well, yeah, simply put, yes, that's also a key objective. And it's probably more important for the Russians than for the Chinese, because for Russia, they would like to ensure that there's, as I mentioned, that the unipolarity doesn't give way to bipolarity with only two centers of power. And the main issue is always diversify. This is what you want, to make sure that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. This is what the Russians saw was their mistake after the Cold War. They put all their eggs in the European basket. Now they don't want to do the same with the Chinese, which is why it's important for Russia to establish other partnerships. And obviously India is a huge giant, which they prioritize. Iran's an important one, but they also would like to improve now with the South Koreans, Japanese. But given that South Africa is one of the BRICS members, it's obviously a big priority as well to align not just their economies, but BRICS also has a tendency to align the political positions, as we see before in the big events. So I think wherever this economic dependency is, political loyalties tends to follow. So I think there's a lot of incentives to improve that partnership.
Thank you. Any follow-up questions? If not, can we give a big hand to Glenn Diesen? Thank you very much, Glenn. Appreciate your talk, and I'll send you the recording.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you again for all taking the time to listen. I appreciate it.
All the best. Good luck. Thank you. Bye. I'll just switch it off. So while I'm switching it off, please help yourself to tea, coffee next door.